Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As you know, these are programs that we've been running through the lockdown, trying to help people understand the implications of the lockdown, whether they be about the health issues, the legal issues, and the economic issues. How are we going to get out of COVID-19? What are the implications for our lifestyles, for our economy, for the social context of South African society? And today I have Professor Mzukisi Qobo, who is the head of the School of Governance at the University of Wits, and he wrote, apart from everything else, wrote a very interesting article a few days ago in the Daily Maverick. It certainly caught my eye. And thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously we can range further than the article, but the article was both very eloquent but also very depressing because in a sense you were saying we're really in serious trouble and we don't seem to be getting out of that. So why are we in the trouble we're in?
Thanks, Just Davis. Thanks for having me. There are many reasons why we are in this crisis that we're in. It did not begin with the corruption around the PPE procurement. It's been long coming. As a society, we've become tolerant of degrees of corruption. If you remember that, if you go back to the early days of our democracy, we had the arms deals debacle, and many people were calling for an amnesty for those who were implicated, a TRC of sorts. And I think these sorts of calls we're softening the ground for greater tolerance for corruption. And then, of course, we had the Nkandla Gate and the sort of the Zuma scandal that decade some call a lost decade. And in the middle of that, there were calls that perhaps we should have amnesty for Mr. Zuma and then have a clean slate. And I think with those calls, society becomes accommodative to corruption. Now we are in another debacle, another scandal. So there is a relationship between these because they are all marked by erosion of institutions. We had the Scorpions, disbanded by government, and now we're calling for the law enforcement authorities to be more robust. Many other institutions were eroded. We saw what happened at SARS. So I think we've reached a point today where we've got to ask ourselves very deep questions as citizens, especially in terms of our relationship with the governing party, our relationship with government, and the responsibility of the president as the commander-in-chief and the single person, at which, in whom the buck stops.
So what you're really tracing is right from the beginning, from the dawn of our democracy, trouble started of this particular kind, and we shouldn't be surprised now. But then that and then apart from all, and then, well, I suppose we put it this way. If that is so, then what is the possibility of getting out of this? If it's so endemic, then how do you restore, let me put it to your field, how do you restore kind of good governance in a society like ours?
I think as long as we don't deflect by talking about state capacities, people talk about state capacities, and this is symptomatic of fundamental defects in the constitution of our democracy, in how our democracy has evolved over the last 2.5 decades, especially the sets of relationship between the party and the state, and the diffused power or decentralization say to provinces and municipalities, where the central authority has very limited reach, and with this decentralization you have a decentralization of corruption, of institutional decay. Now, I'm certainly not saying that power should all be centralized, but that we need to find fixes in the fundamental, in the core of our democracy. One, two, the citizens have power. Judge Davis, citizens have power, and we've transported or abdicated our responsibility to change to those who are in power. So we are disappointed with the ANC, we're disappointed with government, we're calling for renewal, we're calling for reform. What really we should be calling for is the fundamental overhaul of the current political system that we have at a radical level. But at a more moderate level is to put pressure on the president. He has executive authority that is defined by the Constitution to rein in on all of this, to govern and to stare down factions in his party. He has the ability to change his cabinet, to reconstitute the National Command Council. He can change the pieces around. Zuma showed us that it is possible to exercise power, although he did that perversely. President Mbeki showed us that it is possible to use power effectively. What we have not seen is the use of power effectively by the president. He has repackaged power in a form of a sort of intermediation, sort of a multi-stakeholder approach to governing, sort of sharing broadly his decision-making authority. And those he shares it with abuse it because they know that they don't have as much accountability as he does.
So you said an enormous amount there, and I wanted to see if I can unpack some of this because it's all of these are important. Just going back to the first point that you made in response to my question, you spoke about the decentralization. What I take from that is that what you were saying is that if you look at what goes on in corruption in local government, municipal government in particular, and even perhaps provincial government, I mean, as we hear literally almost on a daily basis about some of the provinces, then in a sense, there's that kind of, they're almost on their own. It's almost as if they're in the free to do what they want to because nobody's looking over the shoulder and nobody's doing anything about them. The weird thing about that was, just of your comment, is that when we drafted the Constitution all those years ago, one of the issues, or two of the issues that came up, I suppose, well, number one, certainly Chief Buthelezzi's determination to ensure that there'd be power for KwaZulu-Natal, which he still thought he could control. And second, perhaps the broader issue was that because South Africa had suffered so much from a unitary government in Pretoria, which dictated everything, that if you had sort of more democratic local and provincial government, it would diffuse power and we wouldn't have to repeat the horrible apartheid mistakes again. So just on that, just to start, I mean, would you be advocating changes to that structure because it clearly has been abused in the way you suggest, and which is quite true?
I would say certainly there is a need for review of our systems of governance, of the workings of cooperative governance across the different layers of government. And of course, recently we've introduced another layer, which is, the district, I think it's the district model, district development model, which will not necessarily improve the problems, except that it just sort of shifts it to another layer because all the capacity issues are still unresolved. So I think there is a need for review. I certainly wouldn't want to prescribe what form that should take. But I'm clear in my mind that the crisis has shown us which areas of which levels of government are more needed than others. I do think that we need to pay a closer attention to the provincial layer, that it could very well be superfluous to the requirements of a properly governed and functioning system of governance. So I do think that coming out of this crisis, we need to ask very hard questions about the structures that we have and that are not working well. I do think that there is a place for local government because that's the cold face of public service delivery. And it may very well be that that is where some fixes are required, and you need to rethink the relationship between the center and local authority, especially because the center has resources, so it makes approximations, allocations to local government, and it needs to use sticks and to ensure that these resources are properly utilized. And currently there's too much looseness at that level.
Just if I could just stay there for one more second. In your article, you seem to suggest that one of the problems that we've had right across the board, but certainly local and provincial government, is the way in which a sort of deployment has taken place, so that the best people have not really necessarily got into government, not got into the local government, and we're paying the price of that. So we'd have to change that somehow.
Yeah, Judge Davis, I think this should be a low-hanging fruit for the governing party. It's not just only at local government, but across the government. I just want to give you one example that just demonstrates how we are not serious about meritocracy and competence in government. If you look at the period between, say, 1998 and, say, 2007, you had 70% of our diplomatic missions are headed by trained bureaucrats at Foreign Affairs, people who knew their job, who were trained for their job, and who were in those positions as a result of competence. Between 2007 and now, consistently, 80% of these diplomatic missions are headed by politicians, many of whom have absolutely no idea of how diplomacy works, have never run a foreign policy assignment, and we entrust them to lead our efforts internationally, and 20% are trained. That you find across various elements of government. It's some people made an example of the currently appointed National Youth Development Agency. 90% of those are people with connections to the ANC. You only have one person who has no connection whatsoever, which lends credence to the idea that a lot of public service institutions and agencies are used as trove for cadres. You see this in local government. People have to dispense with patronage to cadres in regional executive committees, to powerful political figures at municipal level. And this weakens our system of governance. And we need to do away with this if we want to see the country working well and the economy functioning as it should.
But when you talk about meritocracy, you're not talking, I'm sure you're not talking about the fact that we do away with a situation whereby we do not try to promote representativity in the country. I mean, bluntly put, you can't,
yeah.
In 94, we were faced with the problem, were we not, that a lot of skills were still in white hands because they had been running government and so on and so forth. But what I think you're saying is that 26 years later, there's a vast population out there who happen, let me be blunt, who happen to be black, but not necessarily cadres. And
I think you put it well. You put it well, Judge Davis. The cry for exclusion.
The reason I'm
sorry. Yeah.
I want to get this idea of meritocracy absolutely clear as to what you're talking about. Sorry for interrupting. Carry on.
No, you're correct. You're correct. I mean, many people, the people who are complaining about exclusion, by and large, are black. People who are complaining about not being, not getting, say, appointments in critical state institutions, are black, by and large. But they complain that these positions are reserved for cadres, for people with membership of the ANC. That applies, say, for an example, to diplomatic assignments, to leading certain key institutions, state-owned enterprises. It's the same. So the same people. I mean, the complaints about, you see, the recycling of the same people who've always been preferred, and those people who've always been preferred have not been preferred because they are black. They have been preferred largely because they are associated with the party and they happen to be black, of course. So my idea of meritocracy is not about undoing equity. In fact, these are not mutually exclusive. You can promote both equity and merit.
Now, I happen to believe firmly in that, if I can interpose for one moment my own belief. Because what I wanted to ask you, if I could just do a sidetrack, you're in the School of Governance. I assume that the generation, a huge amount of talented students, many, because I know from Wits when I teach there, fantastic how the university is transformed into a truly African university in so many ways. All these talented students who presumably don't have social capital or political connections then get lost to the system, which we can ill afford.
Yeah, there's that problem, yes, but also there's the problem of the reputational risk in working in government, which is also becoming an issue today. And I know it sounds contradictory to my initial inputs. Working in government is also increasingly becoming a reputational risk because of the failures of control. In control, the rise in corruption and the idea that has grown in society that government is incompetent. And I've worked in government. I've worked with really wonderful civil servants. They still are hardworking, wonderful civil servants out there, but they kind of now increasingly overshadowed by growing incompetence, especially of politicians, and the failure to provide proper leadership and management in the public sector. So all of that has to change and also to go out there and attract the best talent, principally. Given the fact that many black South Africans are still on the margins in South Africa, I think you need black qualified professionals in government, and of course you do need white expertise. So there's a lot that needs to be fixed in the public service.
Right. So let me then move back to the main point. So we've spoken about the local and the provincial government, and in that response, you then went on to the fact of the president. And one of the things, before I get there, one of the things that you'd written in the article, I think, was it does appear that at some point in the legislation, all sorts of legislation was passed.
Yeah.
I mean, I was astounded to read, even as a lawyer, just how much legislation you documented in the article. So what was going on there? I mean, here you're passing all this legislation, which is exactly doing what we should be doing, and yet none of it gets implemented. So is it kind of a schizoid legislature we have, where they felt they needed to do it, but then nothing gets implemented?
I think a great point. It was Lee Kuan Yew who made this point, and I know he's a controversial figure to many. He said that you can introduce the best constitution in a country and the best institutions, but if the people you put there are morally inadequate, they don't have a moral outlook and a moral language, and they don't have ethical fervor, you are going to your institutions will not help you much. So you do need to balance both. And he made an example of post-colonial countries in the post-colonial aftermath that inherited British institutions and systems and legal institutions, but they collapsed. So there was a time, I think it was in around 2008, if I'm not mistaken, 2012 or so, when Minister Lindiwe Sisulu introduced a public service amendment bill, and promulgated the new school of government. One of the things I said was that the people who need to go through these ethics courses primarily are politicians, not so much public servants, because politicians set an example for public servants. Public servants look at how politicians behave, how their political principles behave, and then they start to do business with the state, because the politicians and their children they are putting up tenders. They are bidding for tenders. They're doing business with the state. So you're not going to get this fixed until you change the caliber and the quality of politician that we have in government. I said something about the need for reshuffle, but maybe a conversation for another time.
I want to talk about that to some extent, but I suppose what you're saying is, bearing in mind that John Lewis died recently in the United States of America, and reminded me of Martin Luther King's great remark about it's the character of the person that really is set everything. And that's what you're saying.
Exactly,
Anything other than the character of the person, whatever the appointment is, that's what we have to do. So then if I could get to the president, so what do you think, if you were sitting, not with me, but with him now, what would you tell him? What do you think? I mean, I'm not talking about like, well, let me rephrase my question. I'm not talking about the long term, because the long term, Keynes once said, in the long run, we're all dead. But I mean, the point in the short term, to show that we're serious about this. There are all sorts of talk now that's taking place. But I suppose what I'm really asking is, if you woke up in the morning, that's why I want advice, and you read that they were doing, not just talking, they were doing, it was being implemented, A, B, and C, then you'd say, goodness, they've actually started to listen to us. What would that be? Because the country is desperate for that.
I think a big confidence building measure, in my view, would be to sink this current cabinet and reorganize. Remember, Judge Davis, that if you put together a team to build a palace, and then all of a sudden, so you go and get the best skills, all of a sudden, a war is declared upon you. You are going to go and find the best generals, not the builders, not the best team that is, that was meant for building a house or a palace. We have a war on us, and many of these ministers are inadequate for the times. They may be well-meaning, but we've seen that some of them are out of their depth. I don't want to mention names. I work with some of these, but the reality is that we need what is in the best interest of the country. So that's the first one. The second one, I would make a big play on building the capacities at the NPA and whisper that they must go for the big fish. For us to be told that someone who stole 3 million rands has been arrested, that's a good thing, but those are flies, to use Xi Jinping's conception. We want the state to go for tigers, big names, to get the big scalp, to make an example that will make the country realize that things have now changed. Your Ace Magashule, for an example, and other big names that have been implicated in various manner of corruption or wrongdoing. That you have to confront the biggest threat to democracy, the biggest threat to the integrity of the state. And those are big names because they carry big consequences. Once you go for those, their constituencies will demobilize. Some will start to realign behind you. But while you give them breathing space, you enable them to undermine your authority. So those are two things I would say the president should do. And finally, the president needs people who are around him who can do some of the shadowy work. All politicians have that. People who are going to, who are his henchmen, so to speak. And who are active, we know that when they have spoken, Mbeki had that, he had your Steve Tshwete, your Penuel Maduna, Zuma had that, the people who still are aligned to him. You need to have that to create a greater good, whereas Zuma did that to create, to pervert the state. It's okay to do that because politics are about the art of the possible. And for you to achieve concrete outcomes, you can't do it when you are acting like a priest or you are sort of, you cut yourself off from the dirty work. So you need to have an extension of people who are going to do some of the dirty work that is necessary to do when you are governing.
So, I mean, the one that really interests me, of course, is the NPA, because I want, obviously, more than entitled to review about the politicians. I'm not going to go there, but and that's for the country to debate. Obviously, that's what a democracy is about. But I am interested in the institutional capacity issue.
Yeah,
you're right. It does seem to me that what you really are saying is it's all very well going to capture a few crooks, but you've got to actually show that the country can hold the people truly culpable of what has been an unbelievable desecration of our constitutional state, to account. And so, are you, when you look at something like the NPA or SARS or any of these institutions, clearly what Mr. Ramaphosa did do was, as soon as he came into office, he changed the management of all of those organizations, which is to his credit. I'm sure you'd agree that he got rid of, But are you disappointed that they've gone so slowly?
I am. I think, the president is well-meaning. I think he really, I had the privilege of sitting in the meetings with him as part of the advisory council. In the room, he is really very worried about what's happening in the country, and he's articulate about the problems. The challenge is outside of the boardroom. You witness a sense of paralysis, and I think there are key institutions. We are in the middle of a crisis, and one who is at the helm of the state has to think about the legacy that they want to leave, i.e., what do they want to be known for if they don't go to the second term. So you've got to play for, you've got to make an assumption that you are not going to have the second term, but you want to make a very bold push for change. And to make that bold push for change, you are going to make a lot of people unhappy, and you might lose your position. So that's really, the mentally, I think that's where our leaders need to be at this point. And then, of course, to answer directly to your question, to give greater priority to institutions that are going to open up the pathway for you to introduce the reforms that are necessary, political and economic reforms.
Now, I want to, as we come to the end, I want to just pick up on one final point that you made, which is very, very interesting. You said, we've got power.
Yeah.
That means separation. I'm interested in that. Those of us who are old enough know that that was true, certainly during the 1980s, when the trade union movement, the United Democratic Front, all of those organizations of which many of us were part of, really, in many ways, were significantly important in bringing down an apartheid regime right across the board, an unbelievable political activism on a sustained period. And there have been times in South Africa recently where that's occurred. But when you say we've got power, why is it that why are we not seeing the same sort of activism as we did then?
I think it's partly to do with comfort. I think many of us who are middle classes are fairly comfortable. We think that we are safe, and we are not. We have this false sense of false comfort. We see this as far away. If you get pictures of people in Mbumbulu or Orange Farm or in Enkanini or Kuyasa in Khayelitsha. It kind of looks like, you know, a distant picture. And I think if we think more, if we have a multi-generational mindset to think about the next generation, about the kind of country my children and my grandchildren at one point are going to inhabit, and to imagine that period and to feel it closely emotionally, I think I would do much more than sit here and share a sort of analytical reflection. I would still do that, but I would push myself to do more. Secondly, some people are starting to think about, I think there's a lot of reference I've had to UDF type days. I'm certainly not advocating to go back to the UDF. I think there were excesses there. There were good things as well. But I think we have some really good civil society movements. I mean, we have NGOs such as the Corruption Watch. I happen to sit on their board. We recently, saw Sanko speaking out against what's happening in the country, COSATU. And I think the climate is ripe for some form of intersectional civil society movement, not as the only answer. There are other spaces. I do talk to some of my colleagues and say, my networks, and say, well, let's use our pen, the power of the pen, to write for audiences in the township, to speak in radios in the township, to profess solutions beyond theory. Let's ignite another ferment of new, fresh ideas and morality in the country. And of course, finally, we still have, as I said sort of earlier, that the cauldron of discontent should be directed at the president. He's the leader, he's the ultimate leader of the country. As sympathetic as we are to him and as a reform-minded leader as he is, but we've got to put pressure on him to act. And of course, finally, there's the power of the ballot that we have, but it's not going to work magic on its own. It's got to be accompanied by all these other things that I've highlighted. Well,
you've raised a huge amount of points this morning in our conversation, all of which I have no doubt about should, and I hope will be debated as we go forward, because you're quite right. I mean, this is a time South Africans are, generally speaking, politically aware, and we are in a crisis, and we have to get out of this. And I think you've given us a huge amount to think about. Thank you so much for participating with me this morning. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Just Davis.
Thanks very much, Lucas. That was terrific. Thank you.